Well, it's time for bed. But Grandpa's going to read his bedtime story, and he wants you to join him, and we're going to read a bedtime story together. How about that? Now you have to promise me that if you and I read our bedtime story, at the end of the story, you're going to go right to bed and sleep very nicely tonight. So, tonight's book is called Make Way for Ducklings by Robert McCloskey. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live. But every time Mr. Mallard saw a place that he thought was good, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles, so they flew on and on. There's Mr. Mallard and Mrs. Mallard. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So down they flapped. There's the island, and there's the bridge. The next morning they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. "Look out," squawked Mrs. Mallard, all in a dither. "You're going to get run over." And when she got her breath, she said, "This is no place for babies, with all these horrid things rushing about. We'll have to look someplace else." So the Mallards flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place there. There's the dome of the State House. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks just like the right place to hatch ducklings." So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. See the nest? And Mrs. Mallard is sitting on her nest. but of course they could swim. And one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the mallards called on Michael every day. See, he's got peanuts in his hand, and there's peanuts on the ground, and they're eating. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go to visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch or to count the eggs to make sure they were all there. Let's count our eggs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, they're all there, Mrs. Mallard. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, and then Lack, then Mack, and Knack, and Whack, and Pack, and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility they had to take care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. Well, look, some of the ducklings are here, but already one is over here in the grass, hiding out, and they have to find him and make sure that he's going to be okay. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So he set off. "I'll meet you in a week in the public gardens," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and how to dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she was perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Awk, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. Here's Mrs. Mallard, and here's everybody except this guy who isn't paying attention. Is he going to catch up with everybody else, or is he going to keep looking the other way? Let's find out. Whoops, he caught up. He's paying attention now. There they waded ashore and waddled along the path until they came to the highway. Look at all the cars. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk went the cars, horns in the speeding cars. Quack went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back. Quack, 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 quack went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quacking. They made such a noise that Michael, the policeman, came waving his arms and blowing his whistle. He planted himself in the center of the road and raised one hand to stop the traffic, then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. See, here she's crossing over the highway, and everybody is coming along nicely. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to the police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the river." Clancy said, "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meantime, Mrs. Mallard had walked and reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well now, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was a police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. And the policemen were holding back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. How about she's going right into the public garden? See the fence and the path into the garden? Inside the gate, they all turned round to say thank you to the policeman. The policeman smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. See Mr. Mallard sitting here on the rock? And everybody's here, and this guy is still trying to catch up. He's a little late, but at least he's obeying. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. You know the swan boats? With the big wooden swan in the back of them? And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. The end. And now, just like you promised, Grandpa says time for bed.